They said nothing to her face, but the silence was louder than words. It followed her down the manicured hallways of Whitestone Academy like a shadow, heavy, unspoken, humming with judgment. The school itself stood like a fortress of privilege, ivy-covered walls, century-old architecture, marble staircases that echoed like cathedrals. On the surface, it was a place of excellence, of merit, of opportunity. But beneath that polished surface was something colder, older, sharper, something that whispered in the ears of students who had never known hunger or fear or the taste of failure. It told them they belonged, that they were chosen, that their last names carried more weight than test scores or dreams. Into that world stepped Amina Johnson. The moment she entered her first class, heads turned, not because she was loud or flashy or even different in any dramatic way. It was the absence of all that. Her stillness, her silence, her presence. She wore a clean but faded navy blazer, 2 sizes too big. Her shoes were scuffed at the toes. Her jeans were old, ironed with care but undeniably second-hand. Her backpack was fraying at the zippers, and her eyes, those dark, focused, fire-forged eyes, scanned the room like she was calculating every variable, every probability, every threat. She took a seat in the back corner, opened her notebook, and said nothing. The others pretended not to watch her. But they did. Closely. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because in their world, her very presence was an anomaly. A scholarship student from the South Bronx. They said it like it was a slur. They didn't know her story, of course. That her mother cleaned offices until midnight just to keep the lights on. That her older cousin had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. That Amina had taught herself calculus at 13 because the school system around her had given up trying. They didn't know any of that, and worse, they didn't care. What they saw was what they chose to see, a girl with skin too dark, an accent too honest, and a silence too dangerous. On the first day, one boy had nudged another and said, "Social experiment, I guess." A girl smirked. "Let's see how long this one lasts." But Amina wasn't listening. She had learned long ago how to block out the noise. She wasn't here to prove she belonged. She was here to conquer. She just hadn't decided how yet. But fate, as always, was already setting the stage, and soon the moment would come. The moment that would crack the glass of their illusions and make them see her not as a guest in their world, but as a threat. They just didn't know it yet. It was the kind of morning that made even marble floors feel cold. The sky outside was a flat, colorless gray, and raindrops slid down the tall windows like tears no one dared to wipe away. The air inside room 304 was thick with that quiet tension that always preceded a pop quiz or a verbal humiliation. Students sat straighter than usual, checking their watches, their phones, pretending not to be nervous. At precisely 8 a.m., the heavy oak door creaked open, and in walked Mr. Langford, the kind of man who believed respect was earned by making others feel small. His steps were measured, his chin tilted upward just enough to suggest that anything beneath an Ivy League pedigree was invisible to him. He paused at the front of the room, adjusted the cuffs of his tweed jacket, elbow patches naturally, and ran one hand through his graying, neatly combed hair. Then, without a word, he turned to the board and began to write. His chalk moved like a scalpel, carving numbers and symbols with surgical precision. 1 line, then another, then 5, 10. A system of equations bloomed across the board, dense, advanced, unforgiving. A few students narrowed their eyes, pretending to follow. One whispered, "What even is that?" Another girl smirked, already losing interest, scrolling something under the desk. Mr. Langford finally turned, chalk in hand, eyes sweeping the room like a hunter searching for weak prey. And then, with chilling casualness, he said, "Ms. Johnson, perhaps you can show us how it's done." The room stilled, and then came the smirks, the subtle glances, the silent bets. No one said it aloud, but they all expected the same thing: panic, stammering, failure. The poor girl was finally being called out. Her moment of exposure, her humiliation. "This should be fun," someone whispered. Amina blinked once, slowly. Her eyes flicked to the board, then to Mr. Langford. Without a word, she stood. Her movements were controlled, almost robotic. She didn't rush, didn't stall. She walked to the board like someone entering a battlefield they'd already mapped out in their dreams. Langford stepped aside, arms crossed, the corners of his mouth twitching in amusement. The chalk felt cold in her hand. She raised it to the board. And then she began to write. Not hesitantly, not tentatively. With purpose, with grace. She didn't erase. She didn't pause. Her lines were clean, her notation crisp, her logic merciless. She used symbols that hadn't been taught yet, shortcuts that hinted at a mind operating 5 levels above the curriculum. The murmurs died instantly. Heads tilted, eyebrows lifted. Even the class clown sat up, frowning slightly. Mr. Langford's expression changed almost imperceptibly, amusement giving way to disbelief, then suspicion, then something close to awe. Amina never looked back. She filled the board like an artist finishing a mural, except this art couldn't be argued with. It was truth in numbers, power in inkless lines. When she reached the solution, flawless, elegant, impossible to deny, she put the chalk down with the softest click and turned. Would you like me to solve it again using eigenvalues? Her voice didn't tremble. Her gaze didn't waver. It was not a question. It was a dare. The silence that followed didn't feel like defeat. It felt like revelation. Amina walked back to her seat, leaving behind not just a solved problem, but the shattered pieces of every assumption they had made about her. And that was just the beginning. After that day, the silence around Amina changed. It wasn't the empty, dismissive kind anymore. It was sharper, tighter, like a stretched string just before it snaps. The atmosphere in Whitestone Academy had shifted in a way that no one could ignore, and it was all because of her. They didn't laugh at her openly now. No one dared. The quiet disdain that had once followed her footsteps was replaced with something colder, more calculating. The stares didn't just glance past her. They lingered. They followed her every move, weighing, measuring, appraising. They looked at her like she was an anomaly, a mistake that had somehow found its way into their world. It was the kind of gaze reserved for something unsettling, like a broken rule that no one quite knew how to address. The subtle tension was palpable in every hallway, every classroom. At Whitestone Academy, brilliance was expected, celebrated even, when it wore the right skin, spoke with the right tone, carried the right last name. The boundaries were invisible but clear. Intelligence had to be packaged in a way that fit the image. Amina's brilliance didn't fit. It was the kind of brilliance that didn't ask for permission, the kind that didn't need validation. It simply was. And that, in the world of Whitestone, was a threat. Brilliance from her? It made them uncomfortable, made them question everything they had ever taken for granted. It shook the foundations of their carefully curated world, and they didn't know how to respond. She hadn't just passed their test. She had torn it apart. She had exposed the flaws they worked so hard to hide, and that made her dangerous. She wasn't the right kind of student. She wasn't the right kind of person. But she was, undeniably, the right kind of genius, and that made them uneasy. The whispers, once muted and dismissive, grew louder. They spread like a wildfire, fueled by insecurity and fear. She must have cheated. Someone fed her the answer. Maybe it was a fluke. These words weren't just meant to dismiss her. They were meant to invalidate her. They were trying to rewrite the story, to make her success something that could be explained away, reduced to an accident. They wanted to erase the fact that she was succeeding not by their rules but in spite of them. Mr. Langford didn't say much in class after that, but his eyes betrayed him. Every time Amina raised her hand, he looked past it, as if it weren't even there. He called on others, ignored her solutions, dismissed her ideas. His behavior was subtle, calculated. He didn't need to say anything for the message to be clear. Once, during a lesson on differential equations, Amina corrected a mistake he made. She wasn't rude, wasn't trying to embarrass him. She simply pointed out the error, the kind of correction any student would make. But instead of acknowledging her, Mr. Langford doubled down. He repeated the incorrect method, dismissed her input, and moved on. A few students glanced at each other, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. They knew she was right. They could see the truth in her solution. But no one spoke up. No one dared. Because that was the first unspoken law at Whitestone. Never challenge the system, especially when the system wore a suit and tenure. Amina kept quiet, for now. But inside, her anger simmered, not the explosive kind, but the cold, focused kind. The kind that doesn't shout. It studies, waits, sharpens. She wasn't going to play their game. She wasn't going to fight them with their own weapons. She would use the tools they had given her, intelligence, strategy, precision, and she would make them regret ever underestimating her. She knew this wasn't just about math. This was about space, about who was allowed to take up room, about who was allowed to be seen as intelligent and who was expected to stay invisible. She had seen it all her life, on subway platforms, where white women clutched their purses tighter near her mother, in corner stores, where clerks followed her brother but smiled at blonde teens stealing candy, in classrooms where some students were always treated as exceptions, while others were always expected to fit the mold. At Whitestone, the same dynamics played out, except the currency was GPA, not dollar bills. But the transactions felt the same. The system was built to exclude, and now Amina had disrupted the economy. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the library, her usual spot in the far back, near the philosophy section, a tall shadow fell across her textbook. "You think you're better than us?" The voice belonged to Pierce Langdon, heir to a law dynasty, captain of the debate team, golden child of the golden elite. He wasn't shouting. That would have been too obvious, too undignified, but the venom in his voice was sharp enough to draw blood. Amina looked up slowly, saying nothing. Pierce leaned closer, his voice lower now, more menacing. "You don't belong here. You're a charity case. You think solving a few problems makes you an equal? This school wasn't built for you." He smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was a smile of pure disdain. "It tolerates you until it doesn't." And just like that, he was gone. No witnesses, no proof. Just the lingering rot of words meant to bruise where no one could see. The attack wasn't just about her being smarter than him. It was a reminder of who she was supposed to be. The invisible one. The one who wasn't supposed to rise above the line. Amina closed her textbook. Her hands were steady, though her heart was not. The weight of his words, the cruelty, the calculated insult, hit deeper than she cared to admit. But she didn't cry, didn't flinch. She had heard worse, felt worse. The difference was, this time, she wasn't going to stay quiet. They had given her a spotlight, whether they intended to or not, and now she was going to use it to burn down the curtain. She had never been one to retreat into silence. This time, she was going to make sure they heard her. What she was planning, no one saw coming. The plan didn't come to Amina all at once. It crept in like a slow dawn, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. She wasn't foolish enough to confront the system head-on. No, that was the mistake so many made. Systems like Whitestone didn't crack under confrontation. They were masters of deflection, of gaslighting. They would rewrite the narrative until the fighter, those who dared to challenge, looked like the true threat. So instead, Amina studied. Not just textbooks or math theorems. She studied people. She studied patterns. Power. She watched carefully. Who sat with whom in the cafeteria? Who interrupted in class and was praised for their confidence, while others, like her, were labeled aggressive for doing the same? She noticed how teachers reacted to different voices saying the same thing, how some students' opinions were validated while others were ignored. Every glance, every gesture, every word was a piece of the puzzle. And slowly, Amina began to collect what Whitestone feared most: evidence. Proof that could not be refuted, no matter how tightly the institution clung to its polished image of fairness. Meanwhile, the school carried on with its usual facade, pretending to be a shining beacon of equality while quietly stifling anyone who didn't fit its narrow definition of success. It was business as usual for them. Mr. Langford handed back a midterm paper where Amina's perfect score had been mysteriously docked 10 points for formatting inconsistencies. No explanation, no opportunity for appeal. At lunch one day, someone left a broken pencil on her tray, and upon closer inspection, she saw the words, "Stay in your lane," scratched into the wood. To them, it was a joke, harmless. But Amina knew better. Racism didn't always wear a hood anymore. Sometimes it wore a blazer and a smirk. It sounded like concern. "Are you sure this class is the right level for you?" It looked like pity. "Maybe you'd feel more comfortable in a different group project." Amina didn't react, not out of fear, but out of strategy. She recorded. She documented every slanted remark, every act of quiet discrimination, every misstep disguised as policy. Screenshots, emails, photographs. She was meticulous. Every night, she wrote, quietly, carefully, building a case so detailed it felt like a thesis. Her file grew longer, more precise, each page a step closer to exposing the ugly truth. She even recorded one of Langford's classes, catching him praising a white male student for a solution that was nearly identical to the one he had dismissed from Amina just days before. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving she was smarter. It was about exposing the system for what it was. She wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. She was preparing for something much bigger. Because Amina knew, she always had known, that somewhere in the glittering web of Whitestone's false smiles and ancient money, there had to be cracks. And she was going to find them. Then, something unexpected happened. It started with a message. Anonymous, short, typed in lowercase. "I saw what he did. You were right." Amina sat back, her pulse quickening as she read the words. Another message followed. "They did the same thing to Janelle last year." She dropped out. One by one, voices began to rise, not loudly, not yet, but enough for Amina to realize she wasn't alone. There were others, silent, burned, watching, and they were waiting for someone to light the match. Amina had no intention of doing this alone, so she decided to speak, not to the school board, not to the principal. She knew how that would go. They would bury her. They would make her the problem. No, Amina wrote an op-ed, anonymously. The title, "The Problem They Didn't See." It wasn't a story of self-pity. It was the story of a school obsessed with excellence, but allergic to equity. It was the story of a classroom where brilliance was only recognized if it came in a familiar package. It was the story of a teacher who couldn't bear the thought of a black girl outshining his chosen favorites. She didn't just tell her own story. She included data. She included quotes, screenshots, and patterns. Amina gave proof, irrefutable proof, of the inequality she had experienced. She sent it first to a student-run publication, then to a local journalist who specialized in education and racial inequality. Within 3 days, the piece exploded. The school tried to contain it, issuing statements, calling emergency meetings, and scrambling to salvage their reputation. But the story had already grown beyond them. It spread like wildfire, shared, reposted, dissected. Some students denied everything, of course. Others doubled down on their cruelty, mocking Amina openly, but many more, started whispering her name with something new in their voices. Not pity, not scorn, respect. And perhaps even more unsettling to the powers that be, fear. Amina didn't speak publicly. Not yet. She let the story speak for her. She let the silence around her become a wall so thick and high that no one could climb over it. She hadn't just solved an equation, she had rewritten the formula, and the world was starting to notice. But what was coming next? What would happen when the world found out exactly who had written the article was going to shake Whitestone Academy to its very foundations. The storm was just beginning, and Amina was ready to watch it tear through the walls they had so carefully built. The reveal came not with a scream, but with a name. One that had been whispered, protected, and finally spoken aloud. Amina Johnson. 3 syllables that now held the weight of an earthquake. The journalist who had published the exposé confirmed it after verifying every detail, and once her name was out, it was like lightning had struck the school's pristine facade. Suddenly, the same students who used to glance past her in hallways began to look again, but this time with wide eyes, some with admiration, others with pure panic. Parents began to call. Emails poured into the administration. A petition for Langford's removal circulated, picking up signatures by the hundreds. But inside the school, it wasn't the outrage that hit hardest. It was the exposure, because Whitestone thrived on secrecy, on silence, on the belief that reputations mattered more than reality. And now, reality was all anyone could talk about. Mr. Langford didn't return to class the next morning, or the next. Amina arrived as usual, silent, collected, dressed in the same simple coat she always wore, but now each step she took seemed to echo louder down the halls. When she sat down in room 304, a substitute introduced himself, nervously glancing at her as if unsure whether to speak or just let her teach the class. The air was heavy, not just with discomfort, but with history being rewritten in real time. Pierce Langdon avoided her gaze. He hadn't spoken to her since the article dropped, though Amina had seen the way his jaw tightened every time her name was mentioned. That was fine. Let him simmer. Let them all feel what it was like to live under scrutiny. She wasn't done yet. The school board announced an investigation. They brought in external auditors, diversity consultants, lawyers, and for the first time in its century-long existence, Whitestone Academy was no longer the one asking the questions. It was the one answering them. Some teachers stood behind her, privately, cautiously, in late-night messages and quiet nods. Others distanced themselves, afraid of what solidarity might cost them. But Amina didn't flinch. She walked through it all like a storm with no fear of rain, because this was never just about her. It was about every kid who had been called lucky instead of brilliant. Every girl who had been told to smile more, speak less. Every black student who had to outwork, outthink, and outrun mediocrity just to be considered average. She began organizing talks, forums, student panels. She invited others to tell their stories, and they came. One by one, voices that had been silenced for years began to speak. One student shared how a teacher had consistently questioned her writing as too advanced for someone from her background. Another spoke of college counselors steering her away from Ivy League applications just to be realistic. The stories tumbled out, raw and relentless. Amina didn't just break the silence, she turned it into a megaphone. By the time the national press caught wind of the story, Whitestone's perfect brochures and promotional videos felt like ancient relics from a broken world. But Amina, she became something else. Not a symbol, not a martyr. Something rarer, a reckoning. And yet, through all the noise, through the fire and change, she never raised her voice. She let her mind speak, her story speak, her truth speak, because she had always known that the hardest equations weren't solved on chalkboards. They were solved in moments like this, when silence is broken, when fear is faced, when the system finally looks in the mirror and sees what it had tried so hard to erase. And though the storm was still raging, one thing was already certain: they would never forget her name again. The weeks following the investigation were a blur, but they were also a turning point. Whitestone Academy's pristine image, carefully constructed over decades, had been shattered beyond repair. But it wasn't just the school's reputation that had cracked. The very core of the institution, its hidden heart built on privilege, power, and a carefully cultivated facade, had been exposed to the light. And like old walls, when the foundation of a structure crumbles, everything built upon it begins to fall. The school board scrambled to regroup, desperate to stabilize the situation, but the momentum Amina had set in motion was undeniable. It was like watching a dam break, a slow, inevitable flood that no one could stop. The whispers about Mr. Langford's past only grew louder, seeping through every corner of the community. The investigation uncovered even more damning evidence: emails, private notes, and testimonies from those too afraid to speak before, evidence that connected Langford to years of questionable actions. What had started as a few scattered pieces of a puzzle quickly morphed into a full picture, one that no one could ignore any longer. Langford was officially suspended, but the damage to Whitestone's reputation was irreversible. The students, once enamored by the school's prestigious image, no longer viewed it as a place of exclusive opportunity. For some, Whitestone had always felt like a gilded cage, a place where only a select few could thrive, while the rest of the student body was left to wither. And now, the illusion was gone. Whitestone wasn't the beacon of success it had portrayed itself to be. It was a breeding ground for systemic inequality, where silence wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. But for Amina, this was never about revenge. It had never been personal. She wasn't fighting for the satisfaction of seeing one man's downfall or the collapse of a single institution. What she was up against was far bigger, a culture of indifference that stretched far beyond the gates of Whitestone Academy. It was a pervasive force found in every corner of society, in every institution where voices were stifled, where the unspoken rules favored a privileged few while silencing the rest. And Amina had pulled back the curtain, revealing just how deep the rot went. This wasn't just about Whitestone anymore. The fight had spread, and it was becoming a movement. Amina spent her days in meetings, organizing protests, working tirelessly to advocate for change. She didn't just speak up for students like her, she became the voice for those who had been marginalized, for anyone who had been made to feel invisible in a world that preferred to ignore them. The student body of Whitestone, once fractured by privilege and fear, began to shift. More and more students of every race, every background, every creed began to question the system that had once been untouchable. And they didn't just question it, they demanded change. They understood now that transformation would never come easily, but they had learned one thing. If they didn't fight for it, nothing would ever change, and change was coming. One cold afternoon, as the last vestiges of winter gave way to spring, Amina stood before a sea of reporters gathered outside the gates of Whitestone Academy. The world was watching her now. Her calm, collected demeanor never wavered, even as the cameras flashed and the reporters shouted questions. This press conference wasn't just about Whitestone's future, it was about something much larger. As she turned to face the crowd, Amina didn't raise her voice, but when she spoke, the silence that followed was palpable. "We're not here to watch things fall apart," she began, her voice steady but filled with purpose. "We're here to build something better." The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "Whitestone may be the beginning," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "but this is a movement for every student who's been told they don't belong, a movement for every teacher who's been silenced, a movement for every parent who's ever been made to feel invisible. This isn't just about the past anymore. This is about the future, and I won't stop until every corner of this country is held accountable, not just Whitestone, but everywhere." The crowd stood motionless, absorbing every word, every breath she took. It was in that moment, standing before them all, with the weight of history resting on her shoulders, that Amina realized something profound. The world hadn't just changed around her, it had changed because of her. The fight was far from over. There was still so much left to do, but for the first time in a long time, Amina felt it, an undeniable truth. The silence had been shattered, and now no one, no matter how powerful, no matter how entrenched, would be able to silence them again. The years that followed were marked by change, but not the kind that came easily. Amina had long since left Whitestone Academy behind, her name now synonymous with the movement she had ignited. She had become more than a figurehead. She had become a symbol of something far greater than herself. She had changed the conversation, but she had also changed the very nature of the fight. It wasn't just about standing up against one institution anymore. It was about dismantling a system that had existed for centuries, one based on exclusion, privilege, and the quiet, unspoken belief that some voices mattered more than others. But even as she traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, advising educational reform initiatives, and continuing her work as an advocate, there were moments when Amina paused. Moments when she allowed herself to reflect on everything she had sacrificed and gained. She thought back to the days at Whitestone, to the countless hours spent fighting for a place where every student could thrive, not just the ones with the right last name or the right skin tone. She remembered the faces of those who had stood with her and the ones who had turned away, and she thought about Langford, not with anger, but with a sense of clarity. He had been a catalyst, but only because he embodied the larger system she had fought to expose. He was a symptom, not the cause. And in the end, it wasn't about him. It had never been. It had always been about the future, the kind of world they wanted to build for the generations that followed. The world she had fought for wasn't perfect. Far from it. But it was better. The next generation of students were speaking up more, demanding better, and not apologizing for their right to succeed. There were still battles to be fought, but there was now a foundation of accountability. The silence that had once protected the powerful was no longer an option. And it was this shift, this unrelenting wave of voices coming together, that gave Amina hope. As she stood before a new class of students at an auditorium one crisp fall morning, the familiar questions floated in the air. What now? What comes next? But Amina had learned something over the years. The answers to those questions weren't for her to give. The answers were for them, for the next generation of thinkers, dreamers, and doers. She stood there, her hands gripping the podium, looking out at the eager, hopeful faces before her. A smile crossed her lips as she realized something that had taken years for her to understand. This wasn't her victory alone. This was theirs too. "You are the change you seek," Amina said softly, her voice carrying through the room. "You're not waiting for permission to make the world better. You're already doing it, and that's the most powerful thing anyone can do." The room filled with applause, but Amina barely noticed it. Her mind was already on the next chapter, the next fight, the next wave of progress. Because the work, the real work, was never done. It would always be a process of rebuilding, of growing, of questioning and evolving. But with each step, with each story shared, with each person who spoke their truth, the world shifted a little bit more. And as Amina left the stage that day, she felt something profound within her. Peace. A peace that came not from the end of the battle, but from knowing that she had been a part of something bigger than herself. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer the fight of one woman against an unjust world. It was the fight of an entire generation, rising up together, determined to make sure that no voice would ever be silenced again. And that, more than anything, was the victory that mattered. And while the fight was difficult, and there's still much work ahead, it's important to remember that change starts with each of us. If you enjoyed this story, if you believe in the power of words and actions, don't forget to support movements and voices like this one. Subscribe to my channel to make sure you never miss a new story that inspires and drives change. Your thoughts, your experiences, they matter. Together, we can make the world a better place. Subscribe and stay with us on this journey toward change.